My name is Tom Harvey. I'm president of the board of the Art Students League, and it's a great honor this evening to welcome you and to welcome Philip Pearlstein here to the league. Thank you all very much for coming. It's a particular pleasure for Executive Director Michael Rips and me to welcome you to this presentation by the distinguished modern realist painter Philip Pearlstein, considered by many to be the preeminent figure painter of the last half century. I would like to say a particular thank you to our own Timothy J. Clark, who invited Mr. Pearlstein to be with us to share some of his thoughts on his own work and art education in general. Mr. Pearlstein was professor of fine art at Brooklyn College for many years and remains a distinguished professor emeritus there. In an article in the New York Times in 1985, he's quoted as saying, "I owe a great deal to teaching. I really found myself as an artist through teaching." Another article about him commented on his voracious appetite for looking. Again, he's quoted as saying, "I get my highs from using my eyes." I know we've all been looking forward to this presentation. Let me now turn the program over to Tim Clark.
Thank you, Tom, and thank all of you for being here tonight, and especially thanks to Philip to agreeing to come. And there's a few more thanks here, and to Tom Freudenheim for agreeing. What's that back hum? Can we get rid of that? For agreeing to be on this panel this evening. But as I continue with these endless thanks, I have to say that they wouldn't happen without Tom Harvey, our board president, who not only gives his time, but he underwrote the Wayne Thiebaud event last month with Kathy Black, his wife, and Tom and Kathy underwrote all the expenses for tonight's event. And that kind of commitment tells you that if you give good things to the league, they give good things come back to you. How about a hand for both of them? When I spoke with Michael Rips, our executive director, and told him that there is a chance, a slim chance, and I'll tell you why it was only a slim chance, that Philip Pearlstein would be here tonight, he said, "Get him and make this happen." He was enthusiastically behind it. Between the two of them, especially, there's a commitment to the highest standards of education. If we're only an okay school, we won't turn out okay. We'll only turn out okay artists. Our job here is not to just train people to be competent. Our job is to train you to be the best you can be, to be masters. And that commitment to the highest standards is really, really important, and we follow it through. Now, when I saw Philip a 3 weeks ago, Mr. Pearlstein, and I said, "Would you care to come to talk at the league to a group of very hungry students, the next generations?" He said, "Tim, I'm 80-14. I had to do the math." Actually, we did that together. He said he was over 90 and he didn't know if he really wanted to do this very much. But I said, just a couple weeks ago, we had Wayne Thiebaud, and he's much older than you. What did you say?
Well, only by 3 years.
He said, "How about Monday the 25th? And so I have to thank you, and I think we're ready to get started. But how about a big hand to welcome Philip Pearl? I think we're going to rename this series the American Masters Series, and you guys are talking to a living master right here today. Now, the first thing I want to talk to you about, Mr. Pearlstein brought some images for you to see, but we had a glitch, and so it's going to be a conversation. And I think that maybe it's lucky for us, but you have a commitment to drawing. And can we get that microphone near you? And can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on drawing and how, because it has historically been an integral part of this art school?
Well, I was kind of a dumb kid in grade school. And
Can you hear? Can you hear? You need to get that, to talk a little closer to the microphone.
okay. In grade school, I was kind of dumb. But I always, for some reason or other, was able to do artwork that the art teachers liked. And they encouraged my parents to let me just keep doing what I was doing. And I managed to make it to high school, along with a few other kids. This was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we had a wonderful high school teacher, and he gathered what kids that were interested in doing art in an after-school program. There were about 15 every term, and I'm trying to remember the year. It was right at the beginning of World War II. It was just about to start.
Can you hear?
Can you hear? Including the Pearl Harbor happened when I was in junior high school. So things were looking very grim and serious. And this was on top of the depression that I and my family were living through. And the high school was a real mix of several different kinds of races in Pittsburgh's Hill District. And most of us were from, I hate to use the term, but the lower classes, meaning economically. And we didn't know what our futures would be. But he encouraged us to be artists, to do the best work we could. And that included sculpture and painting, drawing. And a number of those people went on to become very well known in different fields. My closest friend then was a fellow named Martin Friedman, who ended up as director of the Walker Art Center for many years. And others became designers, industrial designers, others in advertising. And when Mr. Fitzpatrick, our teacher, died, he made the front page of the New York Times as Andy Warhol's high school teacher. And but it went on to list about 15 other well-known artists in various fields. Well, he encouraged us to enter National Scholastic High School Contest. And so 2 paintings I did when I was in the 10th grade, won first prizes, one in oil and one in watercolor, when I was in the 11th grade. And the show started in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie Museum and traveled to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Life magazine, for some reason, decided to write the show up. And my first prize winner in oil show was reproduced half a page. All the others, about 15 of prize winners, were reproduced small. And it made me very famous in Pittsburgh. And I grew up with a bunch of uncles and aunts, no brothers and sisters. My father had a large number of siblings, and they always been making fun of me doing art. So this was my great moment of revenge. Well, a couple years later, I was in the United States Army. I was drafted and I was put into the infantry, but lower than the infantry. We were infantry casualty replacements.
Infantry was?
casualty replacement.
It is lower.
And they told us, don't expect to go home. Somehow or other, this copy of Life magazine, I was smart enough to take with me, and they interviewed the first day you were in the Army, and I flashed Life magazine with my reproductions, which obviously impressed the guy, so he put me in the infantry. But at the end of that training, which was terrible, I was assigned to doing what was called training aids. I was sent to a unit in Florida, also casualty infantry training, to do charts of weapons, how to take them apart, put them together, their names, how to clean them, and so forth, for lectures to incoming draftees. And I worked there for a few months with a group of men who had actually been high-level, mostly advertising and illustration artists. And I picked up so much from them. And then I was put back into infantry basic training all over again. That happened a couple more times. Then I was sent to Italy after two trainings. We were to be in the Battle of Monte Cassino. But that ended the week we arrived. So I was never in battle. But we kept taking training. And then we're moved up to Rome when the Germans left to start a new training camp for older soldiers who'd been cooks, mail clerks, truck drivers, and so forth, to be basic infantry casualty replacements in the final push across the Apennines. And at the last moment, I'd been making all these drawings almost every evening and sending them home through the mail. So right before the training period ended, this lieutenant or master sergeant, I forget, who was in charge of our squad and had to read all our letters, had to censor our mail home, and I'd been sending home all these drawings. He came over to meet me because he liked the drawings. And I had, by that time, the copy of Life magazine was reduced to the page with my reproduction. And I showed him that. His name was Lieutenant Gluck. I don't know what his first name was, but he was from Brooklyn. And he liked the fact I was from Pittsburgh, which he never heard of. But he arranged for me to become a sign painter rather than go up front. And that's why I'm here today.
Good. Now, some people have asked that you lean into the mic just a little bit more.
Okay.
Now, I saw some of those reproductions of some of those drawings that you made when you were, it looked like you were looking across a barbed wire fence at a POW camp.
Yeah, that's one of them.
And they were beautiful drawings, but they kind of told where you were going. They don't look like your mature art, but I can see a little bit of Philip Pearlstein in those drawings of really captured soldiers that were you defending them or drawing them?
Well, I was drawing just the daily experience.
Right.
And I ended up as a sign painter working with German prisoners of war for the last 6 months after the fighting ended in Italy, near Pisa. Incidentally, one of the German prisoners of war, we had a little cabin all to ourselves. And there were two German prisoners who were building these big signs that we had to paint. Because the roads were all bombed out and they needed all these signs for traffic patterns. And they were built out of heavy wood. We had 2 carpenters, and then they prepared the sign for the painting. I sketched it out, but this German fellow executed them. And he managed to tell me that he'd been the head calligrapher for UFA, the German movie studio, and one of his recent movies was called The Blue Angel, which I had not yet seen.
Wow.
But he taught me calligraphy, and a lot of other, I refined my whole approach to drafting under his instruction. I'm sorry we never kept in touch after. But that lasted a few months. And when I came home, back to Pittsburgh, I went back to school under the GI Bill, but I also got a job working on a series of catalogs for Alcoa, the Aluminum Company of America, which is headquartered in Pittsburgh, on things made of aluminum for the building industries. And that became the basis of a portfolio when later I went to New York, along with Andy Warhol, who had been a classmate. He immediately was successful as a draftsman, as a illustrator, and I got a job as a draftsman, as an assistant to a very good, top-notch graphic designer, who before the war was with the Bauhaus, knew all the Bauhaus people, and they kept dropping in on our office. It was amazing.
Who was that?
All those Germans, I can't remember their names. He was from Prague, Czechoslovakian. His name is Ladislav Sutnar. But he encouraged me, because I had a couple years left on the GI Bill, to go study art history. Fortunately, NYU Institute of Fine Arts was taking in every veteran who applied, because we brought money.
You paid your tuition.
They paid, the tuition was guaranteed. And I managed to get an MA in art history all the time, working for Mr. Sutnar around my schedule. I was always painting in the evening. By that time, I was deep into abstract expressionist painting. I wanted no more of realism. And eventually that led me to getting hired to teach, but to teach graphic design at Pratt Institute. And then to fill out my schedule, they gave me a course in figure drawing, which I wasn't interested in as such, but I just used the drawing from the model, from life, as the main element in abstract compositions. Because graphic design is all about our 2 heroes were Mondrian and Matisse. And so I put the drawing of the figure on top of that, and it became such an interesting problem. And these kids, had no knowledge of me or of art history generally, played around with the idea, and it became so fascinating to watch, to see what they did with that idea, that I got caught up in it. And before long, I left abstract expression as a style, as a painter, and began fooling around with the figure as part of an abstract thing. But then the abstraction fell away, and it was all about the figure.
Tom Freudenheim and I are both saying, no, it's still there. Go ahead, Tom, you want to say a word?
I'm just curious about your relationship to other art. That is, when you were in Italy as a GI, did you have any access to the art that was there, or were you really restricted to being on base and all that? And what about the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh? Did that have an influence on you in terms of, because it had a significant collection?
Yeah. Well, I was at Carnegie Institute of Technology, which is
No,
not
I understand that,
yeah.
but I meant the museum was significant even when you were there.
Yeah, in high school there were art classes, Saturday morning classes at the museum. And we would wander around and see the objects, but they never meant much.
Okay. Interesting.
But when the fighting was declared over, I was outside of Rome. And we could come into Rome. And the Germans had just left, the German army. But the Vatican Museum had never closed, even during the German occupation. And so within weeks I was there, and there was a truck ride from where we were camped into Rome every evening and then weekends. And I was with some older guys who were also interested in art, looking. One was had studied to be an opera singer. The other one had been a stage designer on Broadway productions. They were interested in going to the opera every weekend, but we went. We saw everything. The Rome Opera had just revived, and all these famous old, I guess they weren't so old then, but had been famous before the war. We went to those productions. And then weekends, we went to the Vatican Museum. And then the other museums were beginning to reopen, getting their collections back together. And for me, it was a wonderful experience. You know, you walked into the Sistine Chapel, nobody else was there. And we could lie on the floor and look up for as long as we wanted, and nobody bothered us.
Lying on the floor.
But we went all over the Vatican, even down into the vaults where you're not allowed to go now. And fantastic stuff. It still is one of the greatest of the museums. And they had all these, Egyptian art, Greek art, Etruscan art, as well as Michelangelo and Raphael.
Did you draw when you were there? I mean,
I
did
just
you use
looked.
the,
No, I
the
just looked.
sculptures as models or anything?
No.
No.
I just drew outside, street scenes, black market activity, soldiers getting drunk, that sort of thing. But it was and then within a few months after I was transferred up to near Pisa, all of Florence was available. A lot of things are closed, but still, there was still a lot of art on the walls. And the Masaccio, what's it called? The church.
Chapel, Carmine.
The Church of the Carmine. Was down the street from the Uffizi Palace where we parked our truck to pick up the laundry and mail. Everybody else would go off and have a nice time. I'd walk down a couple blocks to the Church of the Carmine and offer a couple, bang on the door, offer a couple cigarettes to the priest who opened it. And I went in and I had the Masaccio chapel all to myself. It was filled with sandbags and scaffolding. So I climb up the sandbags, and hang on to the scaffolding, and be face to face with, Adam and Eve and Christ and the tribute money and St. Peter fishing, that whole thing. I had it all to myself week after week, and I memorized it. And then all these other churches had wonderful art as well. Discovered Giotto, and nobody else was there.
Did you have companions among your GIs that were interested with you in that, or did you feel alone?
Only in Rome.
Only Rome.
In Italy, I would have the whole place to myself.
Wow.
And it was a wonderful experience, but I didn't know what I was looking at. I recognized some of the names, and but I didn't care what the subject was. I was only looking at the technical, trying to analyze them as works of art. So when I went to the Institute, all of that got filled in.
When you were at the Institute, did you feel any sense of being a second-class citizen as not so much as a GI Bill person, but as an artist versus the serious art historian types?
The first day of classes, I sat next to a guy. We didn't know each other. It was just pure accident. And he introduced himself. I introduced myself, but he was Ad Reinhardt, who was already famous. And so I can't say no. He was there, and a couple other artists were. And there was a couple of extremely bright students, including Leo Steinberg and Robert Rosenberg, who were fellow students in a lot of the classes. And we would meet and have discussions about art. And we became rather close friends. And I was in touch with Rosenberg the rest of his life. Rosenblum, was it?
Rosenblum.
Rosenblum.
Right. How about Leo Steinberg?
Well, I would see him periodically.
Right.
And
You know, but
we, I ended up working at Life magazine when
did you show him the spread to get in?
No, when I left Mr. Sudner and working on all those plumbing catalogs, I finally figured if I wanted to be an artist, I had to leave him and try to survive without that daily job. But we had worked on something for Life magazine, some very complicated thing about the CIO, was it? And the AFL,
Yeah.
the two labor unions joining, and they wanted a chart showing the history of each and then the merger. It got so complicated, they finally gave up. It was to be a double-page spread. And Mr. Sutner used it as the basis of the subway map of the subway system that was then posted in all the subways for the first time.
Are you pulling our leg?
No.
No.
But he wanted to make me a junior partner, which would have meant going out and getting work. And I wasn't interested in that.
I have a question that's so clear, and I have my own answer in my head, so maybe it's not fully fair. But so many artists that have been successful have a great love, like you do, of art history. Wayne Thiebaud talked about his love of art history. Alex Katz talks about art history. You went back, got a master's in art history. Do you see actually, I should ask everybody here, do you see the connection? It is more than the skill set. It's so important. Do you have a thought on that?
Well, I had seen Piero. Yeah, I was very influenced by it. things from that I became aware of in Italy as a soldier.
Right.
Like recently, somebody here in this room, asked me to be doing a series of articles on works that have influenced artists. Well, the first thing that jumped into my mind was Piero della Francesca's painting of, the whipping of Christ, which is in this little museum in Umbria. And it's a small painting, but I used it as the basis of my teaching when I started teaching seriously, and having the students analyze it in terms of perspective. But I also had, during those war years, studied the frescoes, King David meeting the Queen of Sheba, that series. And I loved it, but I recognized that there was a heavy intellectual reasoning behind the painting, which isn't always true of famous paintings. And so I spent a lot of time looking at Piero della Francesca at that time. When I was involved with the German prisoners of war, it was that same area, not so far from Pisa. And all that kind of influence.
Right. You and I spoke once about how your work has a traditional, almost fresco look to it, but it's a modern models, modern interiors, and that combination is what a number of artists were doing in Brooklyn, I think, in the '60s. But different look. They all took a different track. Can you talk about that for a second?
I don't know those artists. I thought I was alone.
No, what I meant to say, you were the only one that did that. And can you talk about that?
Well, early on is what I'm talking about. The first years I began teaching, which is, I think it was in 1959 at Pratt. When one of the other courses I was given to teach was called History of Art Workshop, which you try to apply specific lessons from the practices of Renaissance artists to something going on today, or at least that's how I interpreted the course. We weren't given a curriculum. And so the way I approached figure drawing is just placing it in context of an essentially abstract design, which, as I understood design then, graphic design was based on golden section, diagramming of you do it intuitively. You don't have to be conscious of it, but the X's and, dividing and subdividing and all that, combined with shapes from Matisse, was the basis of everything I taught. And I found it again in the Renaissance when I started trying to explain what went on in the Renaissance, 1424. And it's there in that big painting of, I said his name before, now I can't think.
Piero della Francesca?
No, Masaccio.
Masaccio.
It's the big painting of, the fisherman, the Roman tax collector coming to collect it, and St. Peter is fishing in the pond, and all the saints are standing in a circle around the figure of Christ. you can plot it out exactly as a golden section work. Is that my
It's not mine.
Go ahead.
How do you
can
turn
get
it off?
Are you going to talk about Adam? I mean, about Irving, Oiving?
Sure.
Right.
I want to ask you, our mutual friend, Irving Sandler, just died a couple weeks ago.
Right.
And he wrote about you, and I know you were friends. And one of the things that really interested me about him was his ability to kind of negotiate friendships, but not using them, basically, but real genuine friendships with so many artists. Did you feel, since you're lumped together in some ways and then you're not lumped together, in other words, you're kind of, you're thought of as eccentric. You spoke earlier about having left the abstract expressionist mode. How was this group relationship? How did it affect you? Did you feel you were a pioneer? That you were? Did the other artists respect you for doing what you did, even though they were doing something else? And how was that dynamic worked out for you?
Well, it was a little more than that simple. Irving, I became part of a co-op gallery. We only had like 8 or 9 members, the Tanager. And one of the members had been a dishwasher in East Hampton in the summers, and Irving Sandler washed dishes at the same time. And they became friends. Irving then was doing a doctorate on the economic history of America, or something like that. So when the gallery needed somebody to sit to answer the telephone, Angelo, who was the artist, suggested Irving, who needed some money while he was working on his doctorate. So we hired him for like $5 a week, which was a reasonable sum then. And he took the job. But he was all immersed in writing this doctorate, and he gradually became more interested in what was happening in the gallery. Because the gallery became a center for other people to draw. We had kerosene stove. Most of the artists couldn't afford it. So our gallery was warm, and everybody dropped in. And then visiting, there was the Artists Club that met every Friday night. Irving got so interested, he began attending the meetings and began taking extensive notes and got caught up in all the arguments and talked to all the artists he met as often as he could, and he always took notes. And everybody spoke very freely to him because he had no position. Nobody expected him to turn around and be a writer about art. So he got this history together of that generation, an older generation of artists. And he interviewed everybody, not formally, just casually, over and over. In a sense, he became everybody's biographer. The art world was very small then. You could get to know everybody, especially at the Artists Club, which met every Friday night and had these organized discussions. And Irving ended up organizing those discussions and keeping extensive notes. There weren't recording devices that you could carry around easily then. He's the chief historian of that period.
Did you feel different from the abstract artists? In other words, you were among the early people,
Well,
celebrated for not doing abstract art.
no, I was celebrated for having written an article on Francis Picabia and Marcel Duchamp, which was the result of my thesis at the Institute of Fine Arts. And it got published in a new magazine started by Hilton Kramer, which was the first glossy magazine. And it took up about 6 pages. And I'd been going to the Artists Club along with my wife, and we went regularly every Friday night, but we were totally anonymous in the group, just a couple of the young artists. Then suddenly this article appeared, and I was somebody. It wasn't that easy to get articles published then. It was just lucky timing on my part. I was doing this master's thesis on Picabia, and it had to include Duchamp. And nobody had written about them in English for at least 30 years at that point. Picabia had been totally forgotten, and Duchamp was only thought of as this eccentric old man who was playing chess in Washington Square. So the article was really a game changer. It made them important again, and it certainly made me famous for 15 minutes. But that's how I got into the art world. That's how they knew me. And when I began exhibiting as an artist, I wasn't trusted because writers were thought of as spies. And so I was never completely trusted anyway, but I did become pretty friendly with de Kooning and several of the others. And de Kooning gave me a private review of my first show. As you all know, he was quite alcoholic, but he lived upstairs from our gallery on 10th Street. And he, when I had my first show, which was about 6 months after this article came out, and we all had to sit in the gallery during the run of it, I climbed over him one morning. He was sound asleep on the steps, that we climbed up from the sidewalk. And I was sitting there quietly all by myself when he walked in about an hour later, totally sober, and asked my permission to criticize my work. He said he'd been looking at it. By the way, he was teaching at Yale at that time, and he liked giving critiques. He went around each painting, there were about 14 of them, and analyzed it according to the way he thought I had developed it. He was trying to get at my terms, not to impose his sense. That taught me a great deal about teaching, which I applied, much later. To see the work in terms of, whoever had done it, or to listen to their explanation first before giving my opinion. Or he didn't give an opinion, he just suggested ways each of the paintings could have been made a little stronger. It lasted about an hour and a half.
Wow.
Then he got drunk again.
Now,
That's his story.
to continue on that vein for just a second, not getting drunk, But you also taught at Yale. You taught drawing at Yale?
Yeah, well, much later.
Right. And you told me once that one of your finest draftsmen, one of your best drawing students was Bryce Martin.
That's true.
Right. But we know him for being a minimalist.
But he was the best drawing student I'd ever come across
In any place, that's big words.
in any place.
Right.
So I asked to see his work. And when I saw these paintings of all one color, I said, you know, several other people already have a copyright on this. And
Did he take that very well?
he laughed and went on to have a great career doing that.
Well, so if you, before I go to questions, I'm realizing that I didn't fully introduce Tom Freudenheim. I just mentioned that he agreed so graciously to come be part of this panel, but he's been a part of the American art world as the chief curator at the museum at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, director of the Worcester Museum, director of the Baltimore Museum, and just I could go on, and founded the Jewish Museum, first director, and hey, Berlin, are you feeling uncomfortable yet? And a vice president of the Smithsonian. So he comes to us from a very, very, and he also writes criticisms of exhibitions in the Wall Street Journal. So
Can I ask one
can
more
I go
question?
one more? No, no. Go
I'm
ahead.
going to ask one more question. Who matters to you when you read about yourself? In other words, art historians, art critics, friends, whose thoughts about your art do you value?
I can't give the names, but I
Well,
had
no,
some.
I wasn't asking for names. Typologies.
Well, most have been people who I haven't met before they wrote about me. I guess the most influential article on me was written by Rob Storr, long before I met him. And then when we met, we were each surprised. I guess he was surprised by my height, or lack of height. And we've been friends ever since.
Before we really wrap this up, can we take a few questions? Do you mind a few questions?
No, that's okay.
Yes. Oh, and only one question, if we can, please. Yes.
I would say art major at Brooklyn College, graduated in 1959. And my teachers were Ryan Pollack, Ryan Pollack Jr., and Spergo Villa. I think you taught there after I left. I'm wondering what you were teaching figurative art, because we were discouraged from doing anything.
Could you hear the question?
Most of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think she sums it up that when she was in Brooklyn College, they were discouraged from doing figurative art.
Yes.
Do you have a thought on that? Is that?
Right. Well, the Brooklyn College Art Department was started by one of the prominent people, an architect who was part of the Bauhaus movement, who carefully explained to me. He was a little leery about hiring me because I had such a crazy background. You know, the art history, the reputation, whatever it was, as an artist, and but the reason I got the job was that he, through his Bauhaus connections, he knew the man I had worked for, the graphic designer, who I spent about 8 years working for. That's what clinched the job. But he also carefully explained to me that Brooklyn College was set up along the lines of the Bauhaus, where the teaching of art was considered just something to expand the horizons of the students who were there as architects, industrial designers, and so forth, but who were not going to be artists. But they hired people like, Kandinsky and Paul Klee to be the teachers. But it was not aimed at turning out artists as such, but designers. And he liked the fact that I had worked with Mr. Suttner, the graphic designer. And there was one man on the staff who surreptitiously occasionally hired models to draw from. But he paid out of his own pocket for the models. At that point, I was using models almost every day in the studio and paying them myself. So I thought that was okay. So after working in the studio in the morning, the afternoon, we'd go off to afternoon class with the same model, my model, and have a drawing class. It was strictly what you weren't supposed to do. Even Ed Reinhardt, who'd been a good friend over the years, said we were trapped in the elevator one day when it stopped working, between floors. We were there for about a half hour before the elevator got fixed. And during that time, he managed to tell me I was going to be responsible for the souls of all those figures I painted. And he meant it. He was, in spite of what his work looks like, he was a deeply religious man. And his paintings are all about the religion. There's all closely related dark colors. And his closest friend was a monk or a brother who wrote books, a lot of books. He was a member of a group that didn't talk. They lived in silence in their cloister. And Ed would spend a couple of weeks every year with him. So my painting the figure was sort of the opposite of what he was interested in. But he was very friendly.
Yes. Tremendous question. Good question. She studied with you in '63, and she's still waiting for her grade. Yes, back there, please. Did you get the question?
Almost.
Yeah. I think to summarize it, he wants to know whether you use photography at all, or if you're really, he's talking about your commitment to working from life.
Well, as I said, I did work at Life magazine at the end of my career as a graphic designer. And every day this was before I got involved in using the figure as part of my painting. Every day we would get this stack of photographs to use in the articles, and the editors would mark which part of the photograph was important. And then we had to mark them up so that they could be reproduced at different size. There was an in-house, what did they call it?
Dark room.
Not a dark room, but you sent it down.
Photo lab. Well,
No, and you got all these copies back at the different sizes. It's photostat. Which was very popular back then. It's totally disappeared as a technology now. But you get back this endless stack of the same image, at least 10 copies, and crop them according to the suggestion of the editors. And I learned to look at photographs and admire some things in them. But I always wondered, what about the space that they threw away? the part of the photograph that got thrown away. Why? Why was that considered important? I think that had something to do later with the way I allowed the figures, the heads to go off the top of the canvas or so. But I got fed up with photographs. And when I started working with the model, they were alive in school at Pratt Institute. And then at Pratt Institute, one of the other teachers was a woman named Mercedes Matter. Aside from everything else, she was in love with drawing from the figure. And one day at lunch, she invited anyone on the faculty who was interested in working from the figure could come to the living room, her living room, her studio on McDougal Alley. And about 10 people, including artists like Philip Guston and, I can't think of the names now. Anyway, we'd show up at her, in her living room at 6 o'clock and draw from the models until midnight. First very short poses, and then eventually they became longer. And I saw them from the beginning as abstractions, not as personalities. And that meant detailing the object. I saw them as rocks. I'd been painting rocks, drawing and painting rocks, first up in Maine and then the end of Long Island. And then I had a year in Italy on a Fulbright in 57, 58. And I drew the Roman runes as an extension of that. So I started teaching at Pratt the following year, and the models in Mercedes' living room were an extension of drawing the rocks. And that's what they've always been since. And the photographs simply don't give you the experience of looking at a three-dimensional object, especially one that's constantly changing, and trying to keep up with the changes and integrate them into the overall design. In other words, working from the human body is fascinating. Working from photographs is just a job, in my opinion,
Beautifully said.
my experience.
And another one, yes. Somebody else have a question here? Before you all go, we wanted to recognize you, Philip, as not just a superstar in the art world. You've been an educator just as much, and today you've been able to teach a special class here at the Art Students League, and because of that, our director and our president of the board have something for you, and we're grateful for you as superstar and educator.
Michael Rips and I would like to take this opportunity.
Does he need the microphone?
There's a reason we have microphones in here. Make it possible to hear things. Michael Rips and I would like to take this opportunity to present a certificate to Mr. Pearlstein, which reads, "The Art Students League and the American Fine Arts Society, by the unanimous vote of its Board of Control, does hereby convey the title of Honorary Distinguished Faculty Member on Philip Pearlstein. In recognition of his lifetime contribution to the world of art and with appreciation for the courage he's shown in listening to his unique voice. A prodigy in his youth and a superstar today, he is a dedicated modern realist master whose leadership in the art world has resulted in his paintings being in virtually every important museum in the country and around the world. He has been a distinguished art educator for more than 7 decades, and he retains the title of Distinguished Professor Emeritus at Brooklyn College. It is with great pleasure and mutual affection that on this 25th day of June, 2018, we designate Philip Pearlstein an honorary distinguished faculty member of the Art Students League. It is signed by myself, Thomas Harvey, and Michael Rips, Executive Director. So this is an elegant recognition of your contribution today as an important person to join us here at the League, and recognition of a career in art education, as well as producing the highest quality art possible.
Thank you.
Mr. Pearlstein?
I add something?
Of course.
That this fulfills one of my great ambitions, because, you know, the kid I came to New York with and shared a room with for almost a year was Andy Warhol, who invented Superstar, and I always wanted to be one.
As you are now.
Thank you. The microphone.
With the microphone. Well, you've been a superstar to us for decades.
Oh, thank you very much.